senior assessor, Reth Callan had conducted 411 speciesphere interviews across her career, and she assumed, walking into the assessment chamber for human subject designation VOS 7, that this one would proceed exactly like the 411 before it. The protocol never changed. The Concord's Diplomatic Risk Division required a standardized fear taxonomy assessment for any species contracted into sustained joint operations, a clinical instrument Reth herself had helped refine across 30 years of field work, ranking 12 universal fear categories against species-specific weighting to predict behavior under diplomatic stress. Death, isolation, loss of control, failure, betrayal. The list was thorough. The list was, by every metric the Caveshy Behavioral Institute had ever measured, complete. Subject has cleared 6 prior assessments without complication, her research aide, Doven Mesk, said, reviewing the file on the approach to the chamber. Diplomatic liaison, contracted through the Concord's Joint Operations Office, 4 years of field service. No flagged anomalies in any previous psychological evaluation. Then this should take less than an hour, Reth said. Set the recorder, standard opening. Daniel Voss was already seated when they entered, a human in his early 40s with the particular relaxed posture of someone who had sat through this exact kind of formal evaluation enough times to have stopped finding it stressful. He stood when they entered, the human courtesy gesture, and sat back down once Reth gestured for him too. Mr. Voss. Reth took her seat across the table, Doven settling beside her with the recording terminal active. This assessment is standard protocol for all species contracted into sustained Concord joint operations. I will present you with a list of 12 fear categories. I need you to rank them in order of personal relevance. Then I will ask follow-up questions on your top 3 selections. I understand the format, Voss said. I've done versions of this with 3 other species diplomatic corps already. This version uses the Caveshy taxonomy specifically, which differs in structure from other species instruments. Reth slid the data tablet across the table. Please review the 12 categories before ranking. Voss read through the list slowly, the way a careful subject read through any document they intended to take seriously rather than rush. Reth had seen this pacing in hundreds of subjects before. It typically preceded a clean, predictable ranking. What it preceded instead was Voss setting the tablet down, looking at her directly, and saying something that no subject in 411 prior assessments had said before the ranking even began. This list is missing something. Reth had encountered subjects who objected to specific categories before, who argued that one fear should rank higher or lower than the instrument suggested. She had never encountered a subject who challenged the list's completeness before attempting to rank it at all. The taxonomy has been refined across 30 years of cross-species fieldwork, she said. It is considered comprehensive. It's comprehensive for species that experience fear the way these 12 categories assume fear gets experienced. Voss tapped the tablet, not dismissively, the careful tap of someone pointing at a specific gap rather than rejecting the whole. Death, isolation, loss of control, failure, betrayal, physical pain, the unknown, helplessness, irrelevance, judgment, scarcity, and stagnation. That's a thorough list of things a person can be afraid of happening to them. That is the foundation of the taxonomy. Fear is, definitionally, an anticipated negative outcome to the self. For most species, probably. Voss leaned back slightly. Humans have a category that doesn't fit anywhere on that list, and it's not a small category. It might be the largest one we have. Reth glanced at Doven, who had stopped typing the standard procedural notes and was now watching the exchange with the particular attentiveness of someone recognizing, in real time, that the session had departed from its expected shape. Describe it, Reth said. Voss took a moment before answering, the kind of pause Reth had learned across 30 years to distinguish from hesitation. This was not a man deciding whether to answer. This was a man deciding how to phrase something he had clearly thought about before, carefully, in a way that would translate. "Every category on your list is about something happening to me," he said. "Death happening to me, isolation happening to me, failure happening to me. Even betrayal is about someone doing something to me." He paused. Humans have a fear that doesn't point inward like that. It points outward towards someone else, and it's not really fear for ourselves at all. "Give me a specific example." "A parent's fear for their child," Voss said, "not fear of losing the sea." "Hild, which fits cleanly into your isolation or death categories. Fear of failing to protect them from something the parent never gets to control. The fear isn't about what happens to the parent. The parent could survive every version of that fear coming true, and the fear would still have done its full damage, because the fear was never about the parent's own survival in the first place." Reth considered this. That is a variant of failure, fear of failing in a specific role. "It's close to that, but it's not the same shape." Voss shook his head slowly. "Failure in your taxonomy implies a standard you didn't meet. This isn't about a standard. A soldier who throws themselves on top of a wounded teammate during an attack isn't afraid of failing a standard. They're afraid of a future where someone they care about is hurt and they had the capacity to prevent it and didn't use it." He paused again. "That fear doesn't require the soldier to survive the choice. It can fully justify itself even if the soldier dies making it. None of your 12 categories describe a fear that remains completely satisfied with an outcome where the self is destroyed." Reth looked at the list on her own tablet for a long moment. "You're describing altruistic risk tolerance. That's a behavioral pattern, not a fear category. The two are distinct in this taxonomy by design." "I'm describing what produces the behavioral pattern," Voss said. "You can't build an accurate fear taxonomy if you assume every motivating dread is ultimately about the self, even indirectly. Humans have an entire category of fear that activates exclusively when someone else is the one at risk, and it can override every other fear on your list simultaneously, including the fear of death, which your taxonomy treats as the foundational, most powerful entry." Dovin had stopped pretending to take standard notes entirely by this point, and Reth noticed her aide glancing toward the observation panel, where 2 additional Caveshe behavioral researchers had quietly entered to watch. Alerted, Reth assumed, by whoever was monitoring the live feed, and recognizing the session had stopped following protocol in a way worth observing directly. "You're telling me," Reth said, "that this category can override the fear of death." "I'm telling you it regularly does." Voss's tone had not shifted from the same calm, careful register he had used since the interview began. "We have records of soldiers dying to protect strangers they met an hour earlier. Parents who ran into burning structures with no plan beyond reaching a child, no calculation of survival odds at all. People who gave up the last available space on evacuation, transports to someone else's family. None of those people were failing to feel fear. They were experiencing a fear loud enough to make their own death briefly irrelevant by comparison. That sounds, from a clinical standpoint, like the absence of self-preservation instinct." "It's the opposite of an absence." Voss's voice carried, for the first time in the interview, something that was not quite emphasis but was close to it. "Self-preservation doesn't disappear. It gets outranked. The fear for someone else becomes louder than the fear for the self, not because the self-preservation instinct switched off, but because the other fear simply mattered more in that specific moment to that specific person." He looked at Reth directly. "Your taxonomy assumes fear is hierarchical based on universal severity, death at the top, everything else below it. Humans don't experience it that way. The hierarchy reorders itself entirely depending on who else is standing in the blast radius." Reth sat with that for a long moment, aware of the 2 additional researchers behind the observation panel, aware of Dovin's pen no longer moving at all, aware that the standardized hour she had allotted for this assessment had already run past its scheduled length without her noticing the time pass. This is not a minor revision to the instrument, she said finally, more to herself than to Voss. No, Voss said, I don't imagine it is. Reth called a recess after 90 minutes, not because the assessment required one under standard protocol, but because she recognized, with the specific discomfort of a researcher who had built a significant portion of her professional reputation on an instrument's completeness, that she needed to speak with her colleagues before continuing. The two researchers who had entered the observation room were waiting in the hallway when she stepped out, and the senior of the two, Director Sale Hearn, did not waste time with preliminary courtesy. You let the subject restructure the entire taxonomy before completing a single ranking, he said. The subject identified a structural gap that the taxonomy does not currently account for, Reth said. I am not certain restructuring is the wrong response to a structural gap. This instrument has been validated across Y years and 411 prior subjects. 411 prior subjects across how many species experienced this specific fear category in a form significant enough to surface during a clinical interview, Reth asked. I want the honest number, Sale, not the comfortable one. Director Hearn was quiet for a moment. 2, he said finally. Both within species closely related to humans on the empathic behavioral spectrum, neither articulated it with this level of structural precision. Then the gap was always there. We simply never had a subject who could see it clearly enough, or was willing to name it directly, to make us look at it. Reth glanced back toward the assessment chamber door. I would like to continue the interview. I believe what we are documenting today is more valuable than completing the standard ranking exercise on schedule. Hearn studied her for a long moment, the particular look of a senior colleague deciding whether to overrule a junior researcher's judgment or trust it. Continue, he said, but I want the full transcript on my desk by morning. If this requires a formal taxonomy revision, the Institute needs to know before the next contracted species assessment goes forward using an instrument we now know is incomplete. Reth returned to the chamber and found Voss exactly where she had left him, unbothered by the recess, the particular patience of someone who had clearly sat through longer waits in more consequential circumstances than a research interview running over schedule. I'd like to continue, she said, taking her seat. I have a question I did not anticipate needing to ask when this session began. Go ahead. Does this fear category have a name? Something your own species uses internally, rather than the clinical description you've given me. Voss considered this. Different cultures phrase it differently. Some call it love, though that word covers too much ground to be precise here. Some call it duty, though that word implies obligation rather than the involuntary, immediate quality of how the fear actually arrives. He paused. The closest I can give you is something simpler. We call it being responsible for someone, not legally responsible, not formally assigned. Just the plain fact of having decided, somewhere, often without consciously deciding it at all, that another person's well-being now sits inside your own fear response as though it were your own. And this can apply to strangers, not only family, not only people with formal claims on your protection. It can apply within seconds of meeting someone if the circumstances are dire enough. Voss's expression did not change, but something in his voice carried the specific weight of someone speaking from direct memory rather than abstraction. I watched a man I had known for 11 minutes carry an injured stranger across a collapsing platform during an evacuation 4 years ago, on my second field assignment. He didn't know her name until after. He told me afterward he wasn't thinking about himself at all in that moment. The only thing in his head was that she couldn't get herself out and he could get her out, and the not getting her out was the only outcome his mind would let him consider. That is the fear you're describing, failing to act when you have the capacity to help. That's part of it, Voss said. The other part is harder to put into clinical language, but I'll try. It's not just the fear of failing to act. It's the fear of a future, however brief, where you knew you could have done something and chose not to, and you have to keep existing inside that knowledge afterward. He met her eyes. Most humans would rather risk the ending than carry that particular beginning forward. That's not a behavioral pattern you can fully predict with a category built around what happens to the self. It's a fear about what kind of person you'd have to become in the aftermath, and humans generally find that future considerably worse than most of the 12 outcomes on your list. The room had, by the time the formal session concluded 3.5 hours after its scheduled completion, gathered 4 additional Caveshy behavioral researchers behind the observation panel, none of whom Reth had invited, all of whom had apparently been alerted by colleagues passing word through the Institute's internal channels that something unusual was unfolding in Assessment Chamber 7. Reth ended the recording, thanked Voss for his time with the particular formality the protocol required, and watched him gather his materials and leave with the same unhurried calm he had carried through the entire 3.5 hours, as though he had simply answered a series of reasonable questions rather than dismantled, single-handedly, the structural assumption underlying 30 years of comparative fear taxonomy. She found the observation room nearly empty by the time she reached it, the researchers having dispersed too. Spread word of what they had watched rather than remain to discuss it directly, all except Director Hearn, who was still standing at the panel, looking at the now empty chamber through the glass. The transcript is going to require the Institute to revise the foundational structure of an instrument we have used for 30 years, Reth said. Yes, Hearn said. That is not a small admission for an organization built on the completeness of its own research. No, Hearn agreed, it is not. He turned from the glass. Do you understand what actually happened in that room, Reth? I asked a human what he feared most, expecting an answer that would slot cleanly into a category we already understood. And instead he told us our entire framework for understanding fear assumed it was always, eventually, about the self. Reth looked back through the glass at the empty chamber. He answered the question we asked, and in doing so, revealed that the question itself had a category-sized hole in it that none of us had noticed in 30 years, because none of us had ever needed a fear that pointed somewhere other than inward. That is why the room cleared, Hearn said. Not because anyone was frightened of him, because every researcher behind that glass spent 30 years certain we understood the architecture of fear completely, and in 3.5 hours, a single contracted liaison showed us the architecture was missing a wing none of us had ever thought to look for. The Caveshy Behavioral Institute filed a formal taxonomy revision 8 months later, adding a 13th category to an instrument that had stood, unchanged, for 30 years prior. The category's clinical name, after considerable internal debate, settled on a phrase that Reth herself proposed, drawn directly from Voss's own words in the original transcript. Fear of insufficient protection of another. It was, by every measure the Institute's peer reviewers applied, the most behaviorally significant addition the taxonomy had received in its entire history, immediately reclassifying dozens of previously unexplained behavioral anomalies across multiple species' historical records, anomalies that had been filed for years under categories that never quite fit, waiting, Reth now understood, for someone to finally name the thing they were actually describing. She kept a personal copy of the original transcript long after the formal revision was filed, and she found herself returning to one section of it more often than the rest, the section where Voss had described a man carrying a stranger across a collapsing platform, not for any clinical reason, but because she had found, in the months since the interview, that she had not been able to stop thinking about a species whose deepest fear was not protecting their own survival, but protecting someone else's, sometimes within minutes of having met them. She had spent 411 interviews believing she understood fear completely. It had taken one human, answering a question honestly, to show her the wing of the building she had never known was missing. If this one stayed with you, it's in the question Reth almost didn't ask. What does this fear category mean to you, in your own words rather than mine? Most subjects answer a clinical instrument the way the instrument expects to be answered. Daniel Voss looked at 12 categories built entirely around what happens to the self, and calmly pointed out that humans carry an entire architecture of fear that points the other way, toward people they've sometimes known for less time than it took to have the conversation. The room didn't clear because anyone was afraid of him. It cleared because 30 years of careful research had just discovered an entire wing of human fear that had been invisible the whole time, simply because nobody had ever needed to be afraid that way before. Stay human.